College at Cal, Berkeley, and then medical school in San Diego. And then I moved to Seattle for additional training, where I learned about how to do bone marrow transplantation. But at the same time, I really became interested in sickle cell disease. And I ultimately directed a clinic in Seattle called the Odessa Brown Children's Clinic, Sickle Cell Disease Clinic, for children in the central part of Seattle. And since bone marrow transplant was something I was learning, and I was interested in sickle cell disease, many of us, not just me, reasoned that if you could do a bone marrow transplant from a healthy donor, you might be able to cure sickle cell disease. So in the 1990s, I was a member of a team that led a trial that showed just that. We could, with some difficulty, cure sickle cell disease in children using a well-matched brother or sister. About the same time then, in the late 1990s, I actually moved to Oakland in 1999. Dr. Elliot Wyszynski, who is director of the Comprehensive Sickle Cell Disease Program, wanted to expand his program to include transplant and other curative therapies for the program in Oakland. So I joined in 1999, and fast forward to today, I'm now a professor of pediatrics and chief of hematology in the Department of Pediatrics at UCSF, but I continue to run a blood and marrow transplant program at Children's Hospital Oakland. So I've been working at this and committed my career to sickle cell disease for, gosh, three decades now. Early 1990s, we started that trial, more than 3 decades. So I'm not a newcomer. So and I'm committed to finding a way to make a curative option something that's a reality for most, not just some, or not just 1%, but most persons who inherit this disease. So that's my background.
Thank you so much. We are glad that you are here. We are glad that you're very well seasoned with our disease, right? Because that's what we want to hear. Like you know it, you've been there, you've been in the trenches with us. So thank you for being here. Next up, soon to be Dr. Christelle Salomon. Go ahead.
Soon to be, that's right. Hi, my isn't nearly as long as Dr. Walters because I was born in the early 90s. So 3 decades is about right because I'm about to hit mine. My name is Christelle. I am a Boston native, Haitian American. I was born with sickle cell, hemoglobin SC, and I moved to California in the hopes of escaping the very cold, snowy weather of Boston. I was done with it. I was done with the 7 months of cold. So I came over to the West Coast. I had wanted to be a sickle cell doctor thanks to my hematologist, who had really played a pivotal role in me wanting to become a physician. I worked as a clinical research coordinator at UCSF. I went to my master's program. I started medical school and got halfway through before I decided to do the transplant. And Dr. Walters was my transplant doctor. So I am biased because I think he's a fantastic physician and has done a great job in taking care of me. But I've seen the work that he's done outside of me as a patient, and it's wonderful. And when I am not thinking about medicine, not working on science, not doing research, I like to cook lots of food. I like to go on walks. I like to dance, partner dance, salsa, kizomba. Yeah, so that's me. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Too bad we are virtual. I would have loved some food samples, but it's okay. We have the future. And next up, Jimi, please give us a brief introduction or background bio.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jimi Olaghere. I was born in Washington, D.C. Actually, funny story, at the time, my parents are both Nigerian, and in 1985, at the time, they didn't have the amniocentesis test to do the genetic testing to confirm I would have sickle cell. And that's actually why my parents came to the US back then, is to get that test done. And I believe if I hadn't had that test done here in the US, I probably wouldn't be alive today. So just, really getting lucky being born here. We went back to Nigeria as a young kid. And then eventually I came back here really looking to take advantage of the great medical system. I was born with sickle cell, diagnosed at birth, SS. and, really difficult times. Like Christelle, I lived in the Northeast as well, in New Jersey, and I spent probably all winter and early spring living in hospitals and ICUs, and my family, my wife and I were just sick of it. So we decided to move down south to the Atlanta region. We would have preferred out west, but our family was already pissed we were leaving. So we made it easier for them, to eventually get to us. So we picked the southeast as opposed to the west, which of course I preferred the west. But yeah, I think about 3 years ago, I read an article about the first patient. Her name is Victoria Gray, that got her DNA edited, or stem cells, I should say, genes edited through a clinical trial. I reached out, and I was fortunate enough to qualify for that same clinical trial. So I'm functionally cured. I still have sickle cell disease, but now I'm producing overwhelmingly hemoglobin F. So that masks most of the symptoms of sickle cell. I like to call it a cure because it feels like one, but legally, it's actually not a cure. And yeah, I live in Atlanta. I have 3 great children. I couldn't imagine that before being alive. Now I have 3 kids, and yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Very powerful stories. I am looking forward to the presentation. So like I said, I'm super excited. And I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Walters to go ahead and jump in with the key presentation.
I'm going to talk about searching for new therapies for sickle cell disease. And I realize that I'm preaching to the choir with some of my background information, but it's a nice introduction to the meat of the matter that we're going to discuss today. So as everyone knows now, there are alterations in the red blood cells of persons who inherit sickle cell disease that shorten the lifespan and give it this irregular shape that blocks the flow of oxygen and nutrients past blocked blood vessels. And so the idea is that we would convert the appearance on the right to the one on the left, which is that from a healthy person. And so the consequences of having those alterations is that virtually every organ in the body has problems. When there's a blockage to blood flow in the brain, of course, that would cause a stroke, which is in children the leading cause of stroke. Sickle cell disease is, even with preventive measures that we have in place. The spleen, which is part of the immune system, is early in life inactivated and stops functioning, and for that reason leads to a risk of an infection by certain bacteria, as you all know. And then of course pain is the hallmark of the disorder, and it's the reason I find the main reason why persons, both children and adults, might come to me and have an interest in a curative treatment, because the pain really takes over one's existence, as this group knows. And the other issue, in addition to those problems that affect quality of life, is a risk of dying early. So this is I think striking data published by my colleague Michael DeBon, who's at Vanderbilt University, and looking at adults in his program at Vanderbilt, Nashville, and another group of persons, adults in North Carolina. He just took all of the adults who survived to age 20 in his pediatric program and looked at their risk of dying over the next 30 or 40 years. And what he found is that the median survival, that means the point at which half the persons who made it age 20 had died, was occurring at 48 to 55 years of age, which is really striking. That should not be happening. It's a third-year decrement compared to Blacks who don't inherit sickle cell disease. And so this is an example of a health disparity. And as again, this group knows better than I do, there are a lot of reasons why that disparity exists. And one of them is that we have not been getting the funding we need to discover new therapies. So this is a slide that Marcia Treadwell, a colleague of mine in hematology, shared with me, and it just illustrates the disparity. So comparing cystic fibrosis, hemophilia, and sickle cell disease in terms of the level of funding for research, which have, I guess, similar numbers of persons affected in the US, although more with sickle cell disease. only 30 national sites, clinical centers for sickle cell disease compared to 280 for cystic fibrosis, 140 hemophilia. The federal funding per person, 812 per patient with sickle cell disease, compared with nearly 8,000 in philanthropy and 2,800 in federal funding for cystic fibrosis, and then $35,000 per center for hemophilia treatment centers. So, and the only difference between these disorders is one is inherited by Blacks and the others aren't. So it's this sort of thing that really has to change, and I'm hopeful will change, but there's a lot of work to fix this disparity. But this has a direct impact on survival, because if you can't develop new therapies that are curative, that disparity will persist. And so I think Dr. Kamara Jones said this really very nicely. Racism exists. It's a system, saps the strength of all. We must recognize and rectify historical injustices. Resources must be provided according to need. And while deploying these curative therapies, we can't lose sight of the lack of access to quality care for so many with sickle cell disease. So it's all well and good that we develop a curative therapy, but we have to ensure that day-to-day care is also available, is competent, and available where the patients live, not just in those 30 comprehensive centers around the U.S. And so she says we can act to dismantle racism by structures and policies and through personal responsibility. So I think that message is really a clarifying one. So, and then in the course of developing these new therapies, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine developed this consensus study report addressing sickle cell disease, a strategic plan and blueprint for action. So this is meant to guide how we bring these curative therapies to persons who have the disorder. And so gene therapy approaches, including CRISPR technology, are still in development, but could offer potential advantages over the way we've traditionally done a stem cell transplant, because they overcome the problem of not having a suitable donor. And so they urge the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and state Medicaid programs to support the clinical trials and payment for those, so that we can develop these new therapies. And so so this is the sort of policy recommendation that points us in the right direction and should accelerate both access to therapies and developing them. So that's my background. I'm sorry if it was too much of a review for many of you, but I think it's important to acknowledge the playing field that we're dealing with. So with that background, the genomic or gene modification therapies for sickle cell disease are unique in that they use a person as their own donor. So there are a couple of different ways that can happen. So one uses a vector, a virus derived from the AIDS virus, the lentiviral virus, to deliver an anti-sickling gene to the blood stem cell. And so the best tested example is lentiglobin by a company called Bluebird Bio. Then there's the CRISPR technology, and this targets an existing gene, inactivating it in the red blood cell to release and increase the production of fetal hemoglobin. And I think Jimmy will be talking more about this because he participated. It sounds like he participated in the HbSC clinical trial sponsored by a company called CRISPR Therapeutics and Vertex. And then there's another company called Editas that's developing a promising new treatment that uses also the CRISPR technology to alter the fetal globin gene directly, and to make it make more fetal hemoglobin and overcome the consequences of having sickle cell disease. And then there is work that's terribly important, because this is the future of how we'll get this to most patients in the future. Can we just inject the gene editing tools directly into the bloodstream, and then in the body correct the sickle mutation or other blood and we're not going to talk about that today, but that's really the future, I think. So So what are the challenges of gene therapy for sickle cell disease? So patients, families, referring physicians, they have concerns about the high-dose chemotherapy that's needed to carry out the treatment and the side effects. And, at best, we have 6 to 8 years information from the pioneers who first received the treatment. And so we don't yet know, over decades, does the benefit of treatment last, forever? Is there a risk of leukemia, which is a blood cancer, after the treatment? And if so, what is that risk? So again, we need long-term outcomes for safety. And then will the cost and complexity restrict access to care? And I think initially the answer to this is almost certainly yes. And so we need policy and we need resources to begin to address this problem. And because otherwise, the question of broad versus limited availability will not be answered in a favorable way. And then finally, how does gene therapy compare with other disease modifying therapies? So we know we have hydroxyurea, and we know that's effective in most individuals. And then recently we've added voxelotor and crizanlizumab and glutamine too. Which of these is the best? And how does gene therapy compare to the disease modifying? We don't know yet. And so I thought I would just describe the procedure, which is grueling. And Jimmy, I'm sure, will say a lot more about this, so I'm going to skip through this quickly. First, we have to harvest the stem cells, and there's a machine that helps us to do that after we give a medicine to coax the stem cells out of the bone marrow where they normally live into the bloodstream, where we can extract them. And then we ship them to a laboratory where the gene editing reactions can be performed. And then after that, the person getting the treatment receives high-dose chemotherapy, and then the cells are given just like a blood transfusion. And then a long hospital stay waiting for the blood system to recreate itself, hopefully without sickle cell disease, after destroying it first with the high-dose chemotherapy. And I'm sure Jimmy will say more about that. So the challenges are, I'm sorry, I've already showed this. So high-dose chemotherapy has significant side effects: nausea, vomiting, throat and mouth pain in the short term, hair loss that lasts a couple of months, and then bleeding, infection until the blood system recovers. There can be a risk of temporary liver damage and seizures from the chemotherapy. And then long-term side effects include infertility, a risk of leukemia, and then unknown things. So that's part of the decision making. Do these side effects are they outweighed by the chances of being improved or even cured by the? So this is a panel, a graph that's developed by Bluebird Bio for the effect of the treatment on pain.
Dr. Walters,
yes.
Excuse me, I have a question. When you mentioned Oxbryta and crimson, however you say that, crimson, those others, how long would it be before they would know how effective those Veloxator and the other one is?
Compare with gene therapy?
Yes.
Yeah, you would have to compare them head to head, and so that would take a very long time to show, I'm afraid, because first we'd have to get an approved, FDA approved treatment of gene therapy, and then once we had that, we could compare it to the other FDA approved disease modifying therapies. So I would say that would take 5 to 10 years if it was ever feasible to do, because you would kind of, you couldn't really do what we call a randomized study, because you wouldn't want to prevent someone from getting a curative therapy. So just how you would do the comparison would be tricky.
Okay.
Yeah, but we're nowhere close to being able to make that comparison.
Okay.
Thanks for that question. That's really an important one. So each of these dark blue diamonds is an episode of pain in the 2 years before these 25 or so individuals who got the gene therapy treatment. So having lots of pain before the treatment, and then after the treatment, almost all the pain went away with up to 3 years follow-up. So really a spectacular effect. Now I will say this was severe pain that caused hospitalizations or trips to the ER for treatment, and not the kind of pain that most persons with the disease treat at home. So although the pain at home also improved, that took a longer period of time to go away, but really quite an encouraging result. And so this is the adding a healthy copy of the globin gene through the lentiviral vector, but there was a problem. So this table on the left just shows that most of the low blood counts had mouth sores, had some of them continued to have pain, and then in 2018, one person developed leukemia who participated in the clinical trial, and then in 2021, a second person, several years after. And what the studies that were performed looking at the cause of leukemia determined that it wasn't the gene therapy vector. So it wasn't that the extra piece of DNA activated a leukemia causing gene. But there was something about the treatment itself that led to the development of leukemia. And we're just not sure exactly what that is. It's possible that sickle cell disease itself it carries a higher risk of getting leukemia, and that the processing that's involved and the treatment that's involved just accelerates that, or what exactly the issue is. But this also happened when we were using bone marrow as a source of stem cells and not the blood-derived stem cells, which are many more in number. So it's possible that that risk will be much lower than the first two patients that we. But it's something that I tell all of the families and patients referred to me to think about, because I think there is a risk of leukemia after getting one of these gene therapy treatments. And then this is a cartoon from the Vertex CRISPR Therapeutics trial using the CRISPR technology. So what CRISPR does is it uses it uses a system like a spell checker that brings the gene editing machinery directly to the place where you want the change to occur in a stem cell's DNA. And in this case, it inactivates a protein called BCL11A that ordinarily shuts off fetal hemoglobin, and it shuts it off at birth. And so the idea here is that by eliminating that protein, by changing the gene for BCL11A, you might reactivate the fetal hemoglobin and make sickle cell disease a lot better. And we know this would be helpful because, as you can imagine, before the birth of a sickle cell disease in the womb, the only hemoglobin that's made for much of the time in the womb is the fetal hemoglobin. And the reason why the fetal hemoglobin is made is it binds the oxygen more tightly than adult hemoglobin. So obviously the baby in the womb is not breathing air, it's getting its oxygen from mom's blood. And so you need that tighter binding to transfer the oxygen from mom's blood to the baby's blood. So when the baby's born, it has lots of this fetal hemoglobin. You can't tell, as everyone, if a baby has sickle cell disease by a physical exam. You can't even tell by doing a blood count because they won't have anemia. The only way you can tell is to do a careful test looking at the type of hemoglobin that's being made, and you'll detect the sickle hemoglobin that way. So we know that fetal hemoglobin, and those babies in the womb aren't having problems from sickle cell disease. In fact, most babies won't have problems till they're 6 months of age and older. So we know the fetal hemoglobin is protective. So anything that raises that should eliminate the signs and symptoms of the disease. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened in that trial. And here are 30 patients who participated in AXA-cell, and they're making, at 2.5 years after the treatment, 40% fetal hemoglobin. Well, that's just almost like trait, because the strength of the fetal hemoglobin eliminates the pain and other signs and symptoms of the disease. So these patients, these are the hemoglobins from 12.5 to 11.4. So they don't have anemia anymore, and they're not having pain either. So these are two different approaches that should that have been developed and I think are going to be very close to licensing, maybe even as soon as this calendar year. And then I thought I would finish with this project that I'm working on, and I think this is really the best way to do research in sickle cell disease, which is to have a team of scientists and doctors working together. So this project started with a group at the Innovative Genomics Institute. Fyodor Urnov is the scientific director there, and they developed the gene editing tools. And then once we optimized those tools, shifted the work to Don Cohn at UCLA, who has a lab that can then do the processing of the blood stem cells, and then a team in Oakland who could do the experiments to show that after you do the editing, the sickle cell disease is improved, at least as far as we can tell in mice and other preclinical models. So it's this group of talented scientists and doctors who've put together the project that's now close to enrolling patients. And the idea here with and we had a lot of funding from the NIH and from California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. The idea here was to directly correct the sickle cell disease mutation. So we call that change homology-directed repair, and unfortunately, it's not nearly as efficient as the approach I just showed with targeting BCL11A. So that was simply inactivating a gene. Now we have to not only inactivate but then correct it. So that's only going to happen some of the time, but the good news is that you don't have to do it 100% of the time to cure the disease. So this just summarizes our observation in bone marrow transplantation using a brother-sister the donor, that sometimes, for reasons we don't understand, only about 20% of the donor cells will take. But because the donor cells are healthy, they outcompete, they outlast the sickle blood cells in the circulation, and it cures the disease. So based on that experience, we would predict that you only need about 20% of the mutation to be corrected to have an effect. And this is a pie chart, and what we're starting with in sickle cell disease is green. So if you did nothing to correct the mutation, all of the pie would be green. And unfortunately, after we do the reaction, there is some persistent green, and it's about 20% or so of the cells. And each of these represents a stem cell. So this shows the efficiency of the gene editing we're trying to do. The good part of the color is blue. So this is where we've converted sickle cell to healthy. And you can see there we're doing it about 40% of the time in the stem cells. So that's really exciting. That's actually above the target we had hoped to achieve. And then importantly, in red is a very bad thing. This actually introduces a new mutation that inactivates the globin gene. We call it a thalassemia mutation. So what we're hoping is the balance of blue compared to green and red will be favorable. And we think that's our prediction, but until we treat some patients, some participants in a clinical trial, we just won't know. And so we've done the clinical scale manufacturing in Dr. Cohn's lab. And what I'm showing here in this graph is the correction to the introducing of the thalassemia mutation. And this ratio is going to be critical. Now, we think we've corrected enough to be a cure and not to cause a new problem, but that's really what we have to find out in a clinical trial. And we will hopefully be able to learn a lot through this experience. So we do have an investigative new drug number, which enables us to test this approach of CRISPR editing to correct the sickle allele. We have funding from the NIH and from CIRM to do the clinical trial. We think we'll enroll our first patient early next year, and then we'll enroll up to 9 patients, 6 adults and 3 adolescents. So this will take a while to finish, but that's where we are in the project. I also want to say that this is the first time we're using these tools, and I predict it won't be the last time. And what's really great about working with a team that's committed to continuously improving is that we will be able to bring improvements into the pipeline as they occur. So while this is our first attempt at this, it will not be our last. And this, I predict, will be an ongoing continuous improvement until we have something that's actually effective, safe, and available for most patients. So in addition, we need to understand from a person's point of view participating in the clinical trial, is this a useful treatment? So we're going to rely on patient-reported outcomes. We have to explain the risks of getting the treatment and alternatives. I think informed consent is something we're keenly focused on. Would it be better to get to participate in a clinical trial, which would be better to wait until more is known? And are we going to be able to ensure that people who want to participate in the trial and get the new treatment, can they actually do that? And then again, this is where we're headed, and it just summarizes what I just said, which is a safe, effective treatment, accessible to most patients, and also safe in children and adults, and when compared to other treatments, better. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all the important public funding we've had to develop this project, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Hey guys.
I have a question, Dr. Walters. Do you find or have people living with sickle cell been stepping up, eager to be a part of what's to come?
Yeah, I absolutely, but it's a very small number of persons, and they trickle in from all over the country. Okay. So yes, we'll get 10 or 15 emails and various ways of contacting us, and definitely some of those affected by sickle cell disease are excited to participate. Okay. But if you think about the 100,000 plus persons affected by disorder, we're scratching the surface, to be honest. So absolutely, we got a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had a conversation with Dr. Raleigh, and she was just talking about just getting people connected and the new program that she has introduced. And while there's just only 40 people that have reached out to be a part of that process, it's a small amount, but it's still progress. So yeah, that's how I look at it.
The other thing I'd like to point out, these are incredibly courageous people, because it's a completely new treatment. We just don't know its long-term safety. So they're providing an incredible service to their peers who have the disorder to help us learn more about how to do it safely. So that's the other thing I always want to emphasize, is the courageousness of participation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm just so happy that we have Christelle and Jimmy today to talk about their experiences with that, because this is what people need to know and feel comfortable with moving forward because of their experiences and their information. So this is good. This is great. Okay, let's go. I'm excited. I'm excited.
And with that, speaking of courageous, we're going to turn the floor over to Jimmy. Take it away.
Thank you. Yes, I'll quickly start by just expanding on that background I started with during the introduction, being born here, but spending my childhood growing up in Nigeria. I remember as a toddler, back then they didn't have a lot of access to the medications I have now here in the US. But one thing that I remember in particular was just the health disparities in 1985, growing up with sickle cell and eventually moving over to the US and seeing what was available to me if I had been, here. So that's why I'm a big fan of technology and so happy curative therapies like this are in the pipeline. I remember growing up when I experienced my pain crises. Back then, we didn't have any strong pain medication. I had over-the-counter paracetamol, which is like a Tylenol, and a menthol rub. And both my parents would take all night, going back and forth, just rubbing or massaging my back till I literally passed out. And waking up in the morning and, in shock that the pain had somehow been alleviated through paracetamol and some menthol rub, but it felt like it was for hours. And another thing I would do as a toddler growing up is I would run around, school or even the house, and I would find these weird things that I would hide from my parents because I thought I was going crazy. Was eating chalk, foam, and just a bunch of different things I was eating. And then it wasn't until I came to the US and I had been enrolled into Robert Wood Johnson Hospital in New Jersey, and they had a support group. And it wasn't until I heard a girl my age experiencing the same thing. And the doctor, oh yeah, that's called pica or pica. And here I am thinking that I'm going crazy and I'm hiding this behavior from my parents. Same thing with, alleviating my pain. Like I said, it was an overnight experience. And then I moved to the US, when I get a crisis, I'm in the emergency room. And eventually at some point, I get into a bed, and then I finally get infused with, an opioid medication. And as bad as that can be, it alleviated the pain as well in 5 minutes, nothing I've ever experienced in my life. So it was really, I felt really, really lucky that I get to experience all of this because I was born here, and in some sense felt a little bit guilty as well because I had a lot of family members that had the same disease, but didn't have access to all the things I had access to. So that was really, really important. So yeah, we moved here, and one thing I noticed is as I was growing older, the disease itself intensified and was kind of growing older with me as well. And the prices were becoming a lot more difficult to handle. I was spending more time in hospitals. Being in the Northeast, particularly in New Jersey, it was almost a revolving door of the hospital just because of the harsh winters there. I remember having very, very. I remember having a heart attack once just from getting a portacat put in, and the doctor didn't want to give me a blood transfusion. Usually when I have surgery, I had my gallbladder taken out too. I had some experience having surgery, and every time I'd have a surgery, they would do a blood transfusion just to make sure I don't get any other complications. But for this portacat, the insertion, they were like, oh, it's just a small portacat. I don't think you need a transfusion. So we ignored to do the blood transfusion, and that ended up even causing a heart attack and putting me in the hospital for longer. So really had a really, really hard time with the disease. Many times I had given up, and it wasn't until I just decided I'm going to give up on giving up, was what I used to say. And literally try and win my battle against this disease through attrition, and making sure I do everything to overcome. And in some ways, it kind of worked because at one point we had just gotten tired of the quality of life we had in New Jersey. And I should say we because obviously it affected my wife, my caregiver as well, that we decided to move down south. And when we moved down south, things started getting easier. And then we obviously read that fantastic article that I saw Dr. Walters highlight in his presentation of Victoria Gray having a better life, somewhat cured. They've told me to use that term many times, so I don't want to use it, but doing so much better. And at the time, I was just about to be a father myself, and that's what really inspired me about Victoria's story, was to see how she was able to participate in parenthood, which is something that I've always wanted to be, was a parent. So that got me really excited. I get the comments, like the doctor said, we are brave and courageous, but at that time I felt more desperate than anything. I felt like sickle cell was going to win the battle. It had won the battle over every aspect of my life. And this battle I wanted to win because I've just, for some reason, always wanted to be a father. And I remember looking at that big consent form. I didn't even want to look at it. My wife had to force me to look at it, looking at the risks that could potentially be coming down my way with leukemia, all of that crazy stuff. None of it really frightened me as well because I was just so desperate to, get myself released from the shackles of this disease. And I, signed the form, excited, and the journey began. I believe it was in January of 2020. Yeah, I got accepted in December 2019. And January 2020, we started the trial. And it started first with the collection, where they collect your stem cells. You sit on next to an apheresis machine, and it takes as much stem cells as it can out of you. It seems like a simple process where you're just sitting next to a machine and all it's doing is drawing your blood. But it's, aside from collecting stem cells, it's taking a whole lot of blood. And then there's this, I'm not sure why, I'm sure Dr. Walters knows more, but there's this feeling of electrocution that you feel like you're getting electrocuted, your body's shaking. So the way they remedied that was just giving me calcium pills. And I'm not sure why that worked, but I was chewing calcium like they were Tic Tacs, because that was the only thing that was working at the time to stop this weird feeling. Before that, the one thing that they do, they give you an injection. I believe it's Mozobil. It's an injection that stimulates your stem cells and gets it into the blood so it can be drawn out properly. Ideally, it's good to do that collection one time, but for some reason I had to do it 4 times. 4 times, I think probably took me about 6 months, and we were able to finally collect enough of my stem cells to take, in this case, to Boston, where CRISPR and Vertex, their manufacturing plant is located. And during the collection process, I'm also getting a lot of blood exchanges. They're doing something which is called keeping me on ice, just make sure I'm healthy enough to continue being in the trial. So I'm getting all these transplants and doing all the extractions, and it actually hits. And if it wasn't for the fact that we were living down south already, I probably wouldn't have been able to continue in the clinical trial. But because I was local to the Southeast, the transplant was taking place in Nashville. We were able to drive from Atlanta to Nashville and continue this journey. If I had been living in New Jersey, I wouldn't have been able to continue. So that's just another sliver of luck that just finds its way in my life all the time, which obviously I'm very grateful for. And then I think after the collection process, it was now time for the actual transplant, where you get the regimens, the chemotherapy, and you're actually now living on the floor of the hospital. That was quite difficult for me as well. The chemotherapy was, I think the weird thing about it is you see all the stories and it's everywhere, cancer patients and chemotherapy is synonymous. And when you get infused with, I got Bilsofan. When you get infused with it, you're of the mindset that, you're going to start feeling the symptoms as soon as possible. The symptoms actually don't start showing themselves for about 2 weeks. So that in itself was to me, because many times I thought I'd escaped the symptoms of the chemotherapy, and my doctors kept telling me, nope, Jimmy, it's going to hit you. I'm like, no, I think I'm good. I think I beat that. And lo and behold, 2-3 weeks later, the symptoms hit, and I was completely on the floor. Extreme fatigue, tiredness, weakness, loss of hair, and the incredibly painful mouth sores. I think was sometimes when they tell you, you're going to get mouth sores, and you think I can deal with mouth sores, but these mouth sores are of another universe. It was extremely hard to deal with, and that was probably one of the hardest part of the clinical trial, because obviously they need to do that in order to clear out room for your new stem cells.
So,
and
Jimmy, I have a question. So with those sores, were you able to eat?
No, I wasn't able to eat at all, actually. I lost a lot of weight, and the way they kept me healthy or have nutrient was through TPN, and it was just a bag of white fluid that was the only nutrients I was getting. So I was not able to eat at all for almost a month. Even after the transplant, I still experienced nausea 3 or 4 months after. That's how bad it was. I had to go home with the prescription of Zofran because I was just constantly nauseous. And after we had done all that work to clear out my old stem cells, the chemotherapy, they came to the room with my new edited cells, and it was kind of anticlimactic because we had done all this work of taking so much blood from me in order to create these stem cells. and they came back with a syringe this big of my new stem cells, and I was in shock. I'm like, literally, that's after all of this pain I've gone through, this is all we have to show for it. And it's the magical science, because obviously they infuse it to me, and I'm completely a different person now. I think I remember my first, after I got infused, the first week I felt about the same. I think it was not until 2 weeks later that lingering pain that typical sickle cell patients typically have, not the extreme violent crises, just the lingering pain that I had noticed had completely gone. I wasn't feeling any pain at all. I didn't need any pain medication. And as I continued to go through life every day, I just slowly started noticing the differences of what it's like living with sickle cell and what it's like living without it. And to my shock, I'm like, well, it was one, I felt really down for a while, looking at all the missed opportunities in my life that I could have had without sickle cell. And then obviously in order to move forward, you find coping mechanism. And my way was like, all right, this is an opportunity to, be that Jimmy that you've always wanted to be, and that's the way I approached it. But a few of the unique things that were shocking to me as to what it's like to live without sickle cell was was just going to bed without taking any medication and just waking up and feeling better. I remember, for most of my 35 years, every night I needed to take something to sleep. I actually even didn't sleep. I just took naps throughout my life, my 35 years, and never really slept. But one of the cool things I remember after coming home from the transplant was just, having, because I had kids at this point, I had 3 that was one of the things that the transplant, really gave me courage to do, was go out and figure out how to, have children who had struggled before because of sickle cell, infertility. I was on hydroxyurea and all of that, all the crazy stuff. So after the transplant, we did IVF, which the clinical trial does help with. So there's fertility preservation if you are interested in it. But my wife and I had already done this before the trial. But after the trial, I had a lot of courage that I'll be able to keep up with my children now. So
how old were you when you started the process?
I was 35 when I started.
Okay. And how old are you now?
I am 37 now.
Oh, so you're only 2 years in then.
Yeah, about 34 months, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just 2 years in, and I still think getting better every day. I don't think I've gotten to a point where I'm like, all right, this is the ceiling of getting my gene edited. Every day I keep on getting stronger and doing things that I could never do before. Like I said, just being able to keep up with 3 children, all under 3, has been a shock to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that in itself.
That's a project right there. I mean,
yeah.
One of them. Yes.
So having the energy to keep up with them, able to, follow where I always wanted my career to go and have other outside activities. Now I consider myself a rower. I'm rowing every single day. Before, I couldn't climb a flight of stairs without stopping to, catch my breath. Now I row for literally 20, 30 minutes at a time. So it's been fantastic, life-changing experience. And I think for me, moving forward, I've been really focusing my energy, and a few things that Dr. Walters touched on is just the unfortunate situation we are with sickle cell, where it's such a underlooked disease that that you can see, even though we're first in line. We like to say right now, a few of us in the community, that sickle cell is having its 15 minutes of fame. But we're worried that when these technology becomes commercially available, we don't want the same mistakes that has happened, because typically it affects communities of color. And we want to make sure that the same access we're getting to it now in the clinical trial phase is going to be the same access that we're going to get when it's commercially ready for everybody. So I think that's the important work that needs to be done now with gene therapies. One, making sure we get a lot of people in the pipeline to test these things. But one of the things I'm seeing that I don't want people to forget, and Dr. Walters mentioned this as well, it's not going to be as easy as everyone thinks to get people enrolled into this trial, because I experienced this myself, and I was able to talk myself out of it. But a lot of people are so enmeshed with their disease, and it's hard for them. When I qualified for the trial and I came out, my life is different. I can't tell you how many patients I've talked to that my parents have been, my uncle has introduced me to, hey, and I'm seeing a lot of people not interested in, even while sitting in the hospital in a crisis, still like, I don't think this is for me. Like I am so, I'm so embedded in this disease. We've become one that I don't see myself without sickle cell anymore. So I think there's going to be, it's not going to be as easy as we anticipate to get people enrolled into these trials, because people are so enmeshed with their disease. So I think there needs to be a lot of work there, to get people to think that it is, yes, it is going to be a different life when you don't have this disease anymore. But the way I saw it was, when I've been bedridden for years and all these cool things I wanted to do, I couldn't do. Now I can go out and do those things. It's absolutely not the Jimmy with sickle cell anymore, but it's the Jimmy I've always dreamt of. So I think we need to make sure that we're sending the right messages out, because I completely get that. I felt that as well. So another thing that's really important to me is making sure this is available globally. As we saw in the slide the doctor shared, only about 100,000 people suffer from the disease here in the US, but 40 million people suffer from it in Africa. I think 120 million people worldwide. That's why it's important to, invest in technologies like in vivo. I'm a really, really big fan of that method of gene therapy as opposed to the one I went through, which was difficult just for the conditioning alone. The conditioning alone can scare people. But with in vivo, the conditioning might be less harsh or completely non-existent, and it can travel across the world, and you don't need to ship cells from country to manufacturing center, which is right now kind of impossible because of the infrastructure in the countries that need this therapy the most. And like the doctor, the only way I see us getting to places like Africa, India, and actually delivering curative therapies through in vivo technology. So I'm a big fan of that. I'm actually a big fan of genetic therapy myself, obviously because I went through it and I see daily how it's changing my life. So I've been learning more and more about it and ways to make sure it's available for everyone else. And then finally, another thing I always like to touch on when I talk about gene therapy is the ethics around it. Where are we going to draw the line? And I know this might sound selfish. Obviously, I think obviously for diseases that have a life-threatening component to it, gene therapy is extremely important and vital. But I feel like there also needs to be conversations going with representatives from different communities as to where do we stop at, basically playing God. And obviously I don't have the answers, but I think that's a good conversation to continue to have. And that's it for me.
Thank you so very much. Lots of good information there, and very transparent. So I do appreciate that as a warrior myself, right? So I did want to touch on one thing that you did mention before we open it up to everyone for the Q&As. Just the historical context of Black people, Black Americans in particular, with medical apartheid. So we're talking about, Henrietta Lacks. We're talking about the Tuskegee experiment. So there's a reason, a very valid reason why we don't step up to participate, right? And what is going to be key in changing that is representation that, people that have gone through the process, people that are doing the process and working in a collaborative manner, right? So thank you guys for sharing your stories and perspectives. Dr. Walters, being in it for 30 years, like these are the things that matter to me personally, as a sickle cell patient. Also, Jimmy, thank you for speaking to the part about parenthood. That was something that was very important. One of my questions, like, is this something you would recommend for someone that is a parent? I have a 4-year-old, that's a huge, like 2 months down I don't want to be in the hospital. What about people? Vanity. I don't want to have to lose my hair, quality of life. These are the things we're going to weigh out. We have to be honest, right? And transparent with ourselves. So thank you for being very transparent about what you are sharing. It is so critical for our community. Anyone else want to throw a question in the chat? There's a feature on there that you can raise your hand if you want to speak. Also, we are going to do the survey. So the questionnaire, so that you can give feedback on the presentation thus far, that will be going in the chat as well.
I just say that, Jimmy, you look fabulous. I'm so impressed with, I mean, just how healthy you look in this whole process and what you had to deal with. And I want everybody on this call or on this Zoom to understand that while it takes a lot of courage, I think that it's something that people living with sickle cell really need to consider, because it's on the rise, and the more time that passes and the more evidence that is gathered or collected and recognized in all of this process, yes, we as Black people have an issue with all of that, but at some point in time, you and Christelle are examples of, we got to let those things go and recognize that, yes, racism exists, it's out there, but everybody is not out to hurt us, okay? And this particular process is definitely, difficult and challenging to go through, but with examples like you and her, I mean, it's just like, to me, that's motivation and encouragement for us to step up and say, okay, I mean, you're just a fine figure of a man. I don't know though, I can't see all of you, but just looking at you, I would never have known that you had even gone through such a process looking as healthy as you do, just like with Christelle. I mean, it's incredible. And I think that, the way that technology is moving, we need to think about moving our mentality to that level. It's just like every day I look outside my window, and when I see driverless cars, it's amazing to me, I mean, but this is where we are, so.
The Jetsons, we're here.
Yeah, I'm just blown. And I tell my husband, I said, look, there's another one of those cars going by. There's nobody in there. And of course, it scares the hell out of me, right? But they're perfecting the process, just like the process that you and her have experienced. I mean, that's what it's all about. And I just really want to encourage everybody that's on this Zoom that's lived with sickle cell, because I watched my son suffer for many years, and he was just like you, not just like you, but when his kidneys failed, he was like, okay, you know what? I'm so done with this. I'm so through with this. I just need to be out of this. And my approach to him was, and this was my thought, if we get you the kidney, it'll be all good. You'll just still have just sickle cell, and then we'll address that issue, right? But, just like you said, when you're spent, and when you're tired of it, right? So I just want to commend you and let you know that I really appreciate all this information that you're sharing with us today, because I wish that my son had the opportunity that you had. So moving right along, that's all I wanted to say.
Lions, I see your hand up.
Somebody did, right?
With Lions, yes.
Oh yes, yeah. Hi everyone. I have sickle cell SS, and I'd like to thank Dr. Walters for your presentation. Thank you so much for showing us of how this works. And Jimmy, I really appreciated your story, and I related a lot to a lot of what you said. And when you mentioned that some people have an identity that's so ingrained with the sickle cell in spite of the suffering, I'm one of those people. Like, that's my identity. I don't know how to exist outside of sickle cell. Like, it occupies my whole life. like my life is around my medication and my doctor's appointments and my this, that, and the other. Like I had it from since I was an infant, and it was pretty severe, always has been a severe disease for me. And coming to America from Zambia and having access to like pain meds and other drugs has been like awesome. And so I maintained my health quite well with all the other things, Freesis and hydroxy and this, that, and the other. So, but they occupy my life, and it's how I operate. So when you said people don't want to get away from this identity, I totally agree with you. However, I have been getting exposed to the science and to the whole thing, and it's changing my perception and my perspectives, and I'm now willing to go curative, because what you just said is amazing, that you have a life that is completely free. I can't imagine that. So I would be willing to, do a curative thing if it was available to me. Of course, it's not available. It's super expensive and super limited. And I would be happy to know more about the clinical trials that Dr. Walters mentioned. They'll be recruiting through 3 adults and 3 adolescents. If there's an age limit, I may not qualify because I'm advancing in age, thank God. If there's an age limit there, and what some of the criteria will be and who's recruiting, I would like to sign up. So again, thank you so much for holding this meeting and for the presenters, much appreciated. That'll be all for now.
I wanted to quickly say something back to you, Zilos. I experienced it too myself. I used pain that I was going through. I literally have a quote in my bedroom that says, "Never waste your pain." That's how I grew up, to use my pain to drive me to achieve anything I wanted to achieve. And one day I woke up and I had no more pain. So I was unmotivated for almost 6 months because I had been so trained to have this chip on my shoulder called sickle cell to navigate life. And then one day it disappeared. So I had a serious identity crisis that I actually needed to talk to a therapist in order to come out from the cloud of this identity crisis. And how immersed you are with the disease, and I shouldn't say, I don't like to speak for myself because I've gone through it. It's so much better on the other side without it. It is, yes, you will be lost for a few months, but you'll find yourself, and you'll find a new self that you didn't even realize was within you. So I'm so encouraged by the fact that we've converted one person here already. Is the point of doing these things. So thank you for saying that.
Now, I have a question for you, Jimmy, and Dr. Walters and Christelle. How do you think that we can change the mindset of those that are so ingrained in their illness? How do you do, what do we do? How, as a community-based organization, just any suggestions of how to encourage this, more, or just get people to get on board more? What is your thought process?
I think it's important to continue doing things like this. I think it's hearing other people's stories. I wouldn't have never qualified, or I would have never, even though, to be fair, my parents had been pushing me for years to do something about my quality of life through a bone marrow transplant or a stem cell transplant. But it wasn't until I saw Victoria Gray's story that it actually is what moved me to actually take action. I had gone because in order to qualify for the clinical trial I got accepted to, you need to have failed or not have a match from my siblings, which I didn't have a match. But it took me years before I actually took action on having my sisters do the test, because I just, at the time I was, everyone, mostly, I don't want to speak for everyone, but at least with me personally, I'd given up. I was just at this point in my life just existing, and it wasn't until I saw Victoria Gray's story and her story really moved me, particularly that parent aspect, that she could go to soccer games now. She could be a soccer mom and do all these cool things. So I think just making sure that we are seeing other people that were scared and also had the same enmeshment with their disease, keep on preaching the word that actually outside of your disease, there's probably something a lot more magical out there that, you know, is less burdensome. It can potentially have a longer, better life. So as long as we just keep telling stories of people that have gone through it, I think is a good way.
Absolutely. I'm in total agreement. And as a therapist by trade, I love the fact that you sought out therapy. I would hope and wish that therapy is readily available for participants throughout the trials, right? And throughout the actual process of receiving the gene transplant. And I do, Ms. Lyons she posed the question about age limit. So is there an age limit? Because what I saw on the website, the cap was at 40, and some of us are forever 21. So we're curious, what is the age limit, if there is one?
This Dr. Walters, it varies from study to study, and some it's 40 and others it's 45. At our hospital, because we're a children's hospital, we have to stop at age 30, but we do have partner participants at other hospitals who accept older adults. So hopefully we can accommodate more. I would just add to the last question. When I first started doing bone marrow transplants, it was just in pretty young children, so they didn't really understand what it all. So now when I see them, years later, they have no memory of ever having sickle cell disease. And it wasn't until I started treating adults, which is fairly recently, in these clinical trials that I became aware of this issue of like. The adults have been a warrior all their lives, and that's their identity. Their community is their relationships within the family all have to do with the disease, and they become part of the family in the hospital if they're in the hospital a lot. And when they're better, they lose all that. And so there's this period of mourning, I think, that occurs. So now that we're aware of it, I think we're doing a better job preparing the participants for this reaction. But I think you're right, Alon. I think there needs to be support services before, during, and after to counteract.
I'm volunteering myself.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to take you up on that.
Kaiser. But yeah, it's important. I think about relatives, that the battles that they have. I have SC myself, but I'm thinking about a relative that has SS and how frequently he is in the hospital. And it's so unfortunate because it's like Jimmy said, it's like the new Jimmy, the Jimmy I always wanted to be. And Janelle, I saw your comment that you love the quote, "Never waste your pain," but reframing that, never waste your health, and we have to start thinking like that, because we're not going to get those volunteers in clinical trials unless we're changing our thought process toward it. So yeah. It's huge, for our community, especially because we're so distrustful. We don't trust our cousins in our house sometimes,
On that note, can I jump in real fast on that note? Yeah. So I've thought a lot about this.
I think it's your turn anyway.
Yeah, right.
I know I didn't know if we were going to pause or I don't want to jump in prematurely, but just to talk on that point is I think it's a multifactorial contribution to that mindset. I think there is the practical sense of sickle cell does consume your life. You have to pack enough clothes if it's going to be cold. You have to know if you're going to have enough water. You have to know if there's going to be somewhere you could stop and sit down. Every single thing you do is in the context of, I don't want to make my life worse through a pain crisis, because anything you do could be that trigger. Oh, I'm stressed and I didn't get enough sleep. Now you're like, oh, that causes sickle cell pain crisis. And you're out here just trying to navigate the world, trying to do everything you can to not get yourself to a place where you need to go to the hospital. And so that consumes it on a practical, physiological sense. And then there's also, I think, on that topic of distrust, there is, and also the distrust with a giving up. And I think that people who start off, and I'll speak for myself, I am someone who has always been like, yo, sign me up for this trial. I want to contribute to this. It might take me a while. I want to think through everything before I make that decision, but I am eager to look into options that are uncertain. And I think the thing that made me give up and give into this idea that sickle cell would always be my life was having clinicians turn me down and tell me that I shouldn't be interested, or that this wouldn't be for me, and that this is the max amount of suffering, like this is the suffering I'm going to have and I should just deal with it. I think there's a combination of I think in our community, we need to shift our mindset and dream bigger for ourselves. And also, I think clinicians need to contribute to that and support us in those dreams, also wanting the best for us and not accepting the bare minimum. And so I feel like when I would go to the hospital and get denied pain medication, get denied referrals to a hematologist, it made me give up. And I basically was like, well, this is my life. My life is suffering. My life is people not listening to me. And so I think the responsibility for breaking that tie between sickle cell and identity comes through our own personal development and visionary thinking, and also the support of the medical system that claims to want to support us in these things, but hasn't done the work to earn our trust back. So I always like to put responsibility where it's due, and it's not just us, it's also the system that is supposed to take care of us.
Very, very well stated.
Absolutely. I can absolutely, girlfriend. Absolutely.
And I'm big on being a part of the change that you want to see.
Yes,
So
ma'am. Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Our
doctor will be our next speaker.
Yes.
Do you want to take the break now, or?
I think we'll do it. I mean, we could keep going, but I think a break would be good.
Are we gonna roll through it? I'm okay with rolling through it.
All right.
Okay, let's do it. The floor is yours.
Let's go. Okay, yeah, I just want to say this has been so delightful and enriching for my soul to see, again, like I just talked about, clinicians and patients together. That combination is just so inspiring. And Jimmy, I will say, I watched a lecture and you were a guest speaker on that lecture. And you were the one who made me change the switch. I was like, I need to do this. I need to look into it. So I will say thank you so much for sharing your experience as always. And it really makes a bigger impact than you could even imagine. Yeah. So, okay, jumping into my part, I think I have a few different goals for what I want to talk about. And I didn't prepare any slides because I wanted it to feel like a conversation, and feel free to interrupt me at any point. So the things that I want to cover are what led me to consider curative therapy, the challenges I faced en route to curative therapy. I did not do gene therapy. Challenges I faced en route to curative therapy, my transplant experience, because I feel like there's not a lot of information of that in the sickle cell community, and then sharing with you what I learned and the things that I think could benefit us as patients, and also things that I think would help improve clinician support of us. So going into what led me to consider a curative therapy, it was similar to Jimmy. I don't have children. I am a single individual. I didn't even have a pet, but there's something about being able, like getting to a place of desperation with your life and thinking, is this going to be it forever? And so I had shared earlier that I started medical school, and that has been a vision of mine, was to become a physician. And even at that point, while in medical school, I had already given up on certain other dreams that I had because of sickle cell. And in college, I had a lot of challenges with sickle cell disease and getting through my classes. I thankfully had clinicians who were super supportive of me, but I had teachers who were not. And I was told that I had to show up for an exam or get a 0 even though I had been out the entire week beforehand. I had a letter with my clinician's signature and hospital letterhead, and it felt like no matter what I did, people didn't care that I was suffering. So I internalized this idea that maybe I was complaining too much. Maybe I didn't need the accommodations I was asking for. Maybe I didn't have it within me to do all the things that I wanted to do. And so I had been working in a research lab throughout college, and I wanted to do an MD, PhD, a dual degree program. And I let go of my PhD dream because I thought that, you know what, you have sickle cell, 4 years of medical school is enough. Just call it quits and cut your losses and go with what you've got in your hands. And so it took me a couple of years, ended up getting into med school, and I thought I had finally made it. But it was interesting because I couldn't even enjoy my season of getting into this thing that I'd always dreamed of, because literally the first day of school, I was in pain. So everyone's excited, everyone's taking pictures, and I'm like, I'm really trying hard not to pop a morphine pill because I want to remember, I want to be present, I want to be awake, but everything in my body is screaming at me. And that was basically a summary of my entire medical school experience. For the first 2 years, it was me pushing through pain, pushing through side effects from medications, and showing up to class and acting like everything was okay. And that really does a number on your psyche, as most patients with sickle cell will know. And so when I got into my second year, I was really wondering, how am I going to make this work? Hospitals are air conditioned. I actually have to be present, standing on my feet all day, performing physical exams on patients. I couldn't even test patients' strength because I was in pain. I physically can't do this thing that will allow me to do the job that I want to do. And I got to a point where I was like, I can't live like this anymore. This is actually not okay. And so I decided to take a leave of absence from medical school. And it was at that time, one of my old coworkers at UCSF reached out to me, and she was working with Dr. Walters. And I was telling her about what I was going through in med school and that I'd taken a break. And she was like, you know what, you should talk to Dr. Walters. You should see what he's up to. And I wanted to work with Dr. Walters clinically, and from an academic perspective, but I ended up spending the whole meeting asking him, so what is a transplant? And do I qualify? And am I too old? And all these fears that I had about not being able to do a transplant. So he gave me some good insight, and I went away and I thought about it. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to try. And once I had made that decision, I thought, all right, things are going to get better. But it's interesting, the challenges that I faced en route to that. Even after my mindset was starting to change, there were still practical barriers that I had to overcome in order to make transplant a reality for me. And one of the things that I really struggled with in Southern California was getting access to a sickle cell specialist. And I had a hematologist who did not specialize in sickle cell disease. They specialized in oncology, so mainly taking care of patients with cancer. And, bless her soul, she genuinely cared for me. But I would ask her lots of questions. She's like, that's not my area of expertise. And we eventually got around to wanting to refer me to a sickle cell specialist. And time again, Medi-Cal would deny my referral, saying that I didn't need one. And then she, out of the goodness of her heart, reached out to another colleague who was a specialist, got the information about how to dose my crizanlizumab, how to refer me for Endari, and how do I get my Endari prescription. And then that was denied because I didn't have a sickle specialist. So it was kind of like this constant road, this going in circles, trying to get access to what I need, to the place where I finally did get access to a sickle cell specialist. And I was so excited. I met her, and she was really knowledgeable, really cared about me, and was very proactive in getting me in. And so I really did appreciate that. But then I hit another roadblock. Not having access to expertise in curative therapy. There are so many steps. You can understand how to treat sickle cell in the day-to-day and understand what to do in the hospital, but is there enough information about when is it reasonable for us to consider curative therapy for you. And I think in combination with all of this stuff being really new, we're talking about first in human trials, we're talking about gene therapy that hasn't kind of fully gotten off the ground for more than 2 to 5 years. There's so much clinicians have yet to know if they're not spending every single day, like Dr. Walters, entrenched in transplantation, entrenched in sickle cell disease, entrenched in gene therapy. There are things that are slipping through the cracks in terms of clinicians' knowledge. And I think above all of those things, what was the underbelly, the foundation of the difficulties I had accessing information about gene therapy, transplantation therapy, and about cures in sickle cell disease was kind of normalization of my suffering. I think that was really what I was met with, was that you're not dying, you aren't failing that badly, your AVN isn't that bad, let's wait. And also not understanding the eligibility criteria. So I'm reading these things. I'm like, okay, I'm learning online that people who are my age can get transplants and can get gene therapy. People who are not dying can qualify for curative therapy. But when I go and talk about this, I'm being turned away from that. And so that was really, those were some of the challenges I faced to getting to that point. And later I'll talk about exactly, Elon, you're not sick enough. Later on, I'll talk about how I worked through getting those challenges. So thank God, Dr. Walters comes into the picture again. I reach out to him, and we have a very balanced, frank, honest, transparent conversation about transplantation. And I had a brother, thank God, who was a 12 out of 12, perfect HLA match. And so we decided it was reasonable to move forward with a curative therapy, given that, as Jimmy said, sickle cell disease gets older with you, and it was getting out of control. And so the transplant itself, it's like a mixture of emotions and feelings, and there's this excitement about potentially living that life I always wanted to live, like Jimmy mentioned. And there's also the fears of, oh my gosh, am I gonna have the worst side effects? Am I gonna develop a secondary cancer? Is this not going to work? And I have to live with the fact that I tried and I risked everything and it didn't turn out the way I wanted to. Do I want to be disappointed? There were so many, the emotions are up and down, up and down, up and down. And the process itself is very long. Similar to Jimmy, I had a lot of exchange transfusions, that's the name. A lot of exchange transfusions to, keep my bone marrow from constantly having to produce, because that's how sickle cell works. So getting exchange transfusions, signing the consent form, getting a whole bunch of tests to make sure there's an understanding of my baseline health before I go through something as transformative and invasive as a transplant. Getting my brother to do all these tests, it takes a lot from a caregiver to be present and to kind of give up a lot of what's going on in their lives to be there for you as you're going through this process. And in the hospital, I had this fear of not engrafting. Even though I wasn't having a lot of symptoms, I was still feeling okay. I loved everyone there. I'm like, is this not going to work? Is this not? So the wait is really a lot. And it was anticlimactic to get the transplant. Like, it just looks like blood going in. And I'm like, is this it? Is this happening? And so after I finally started to show signs of engraftment, there's kind of like this euphoria. You're like, this is going to work. This is amazing. I was discharged. And in my mind, I'm thinking everything is behind me. And that's when I realized, oh, wait, we're not done. And so I think what really caught me off guard was the side effects and getting weird viruses and this constant feeling of, I don't know what's wrong with me. Because with sickle cell, I always knew what was wrong. After living with sickle cell for 30 years, you know what sickle cell pain feels like. You know what's going to bring on your symptoms. And all of a sudden, you get a new rash that starts spreading everywhere. And you're like, I've never seen anything like this before. And I don't know what this is. you have a fever and it's like, all right, and now I got to call the doctor. Everything was a new unknown territory for me to explore. And that can be distressing, given the fact that you want this thing to work, you're so excited, but there are still hurdles along the way. And I think one of the biggest challenges for me was getting a glimpse of feeling normal and that pain-free life, where you're like, oh my gosh, like you wake up and you don't have pain, and then something going wrong in terms of feeling a new side effect. And during my transplant recovery process, I became basically wheelchair bound because I had side effects to the anti-rejection medication that I was taking. And that took a toll on me mentally, because after I had felt this high of like, I can go on a walk for 30 minutes and not cause pain, now I'm wearing 2 ankle braces and I need a wheelchair. And so I think it's important to really prepare your mind for all the different ups and downs that you'll experience in the journey, and to not give up. And therapy played a really big, important role in me being able to stick through with the decision that I made, even though it's not a linear path. And so now I'm happy to say that I am, again, like Jimmy, living this crazy new life that I could only occasionally dream of. I wouldn't let myself dream too big because it scared me. Now I went on a jog last week for 15 minutes. And, were you going to jump in and say something, Nadia?
Oh, I was just going to say, you were talking about a rash. I was thinking about a young lady that passed away very young, 13 years old. And she went through I was just looking at the text, and the transplant was successful, but she developed graft versus host disease.
Yes.
So
that is a risk too.
Right. So, and then of course she got a virus while in the hospital, and her immune system was so low she couldn't fight it, so she passed away. So I was just trying to figure out, when you were talking about that rash thing, I was wondering, was that it, or was it something else? That's all.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, I didn't touch on graft versus host disease, which is a very real potential side effect of transplantation, and something you have to come to terms with. Like, is this a risk I'm willing to take to exchange one disease for something else? And it can be very severe. I thankfully did not have graft versus host disease, and that's something that my hospital is very diligent about, always asking about your symptoms. Like, are you experiencing X, Y, Z, A, B, C? Always trying to rule in or out whether or not you could be experiencing symptoms of GVHD. So I got a rash.
I have a question for Dr. Walters.
Yeah.
So how many people contract that? I mean, this was a 13-year-old. So I'm just wondering, because she was not an adult. I mean, does it make a difference because she was young, or is it something? I mean, and Christelle is older. How does that work?
Yeah, the young girl you're talking about received a mismatched donor transplant, and Christelle received a perfectly matched brother as the donor, and that makes all the difference. So it's how mismatched the donor is, which is can be critical.
Okay.
So you're more likely to get that complication if there's a mismatch.
Okay.
Because the way it works is the immune system, uses that HLA identity system like a barcode, and your immune system is constantly scanning the barcode of everything it runs into, and looking for germs. And because the germ isn't going to have the right barcode, it'll attack the germ and kill it. But you can imagine after a transplant, if there's a mismatch, then you have this mixture of these two immune systems barcoding each other, and they tend to attack each other, and that's what graft versus host disease is.
Okay, because she said the transplant was successful and she was healed from the sickle cell.
Yeah.
And she came home for 4 weeks and then developed the graft versus host disease. So I'm just wanting more information. That's all.
Yeah, and I think the mismatching is the key problem.
Okay.
So how do you mitigate that with like someone like myself? I have a bunch of half siblings.
Yeah.
I have my son. Where would I find a donor? What are the
Yeah,
chances?
so the half matching can be successful, and we have new techniques to do that, but it still has a higher risk of this complication, which is a terrible complication, than if you had a completely well-matched donor. So
And then what about me being my own donor?
yeah, that's where the gene
Because
therapy
I like
has
to
an
do everything
advantage.
myself.
Yeah, if we do gene therapy and you become your own donor, you are not going to get graft versus host disease,
Yeah.
and you're not going to reject those cells. So that's the main advantage of gene therapy, if it's safe and effective. So that's what we're trying to figure out.
Okay, so just let me make sure that I'm clear and I understand this. So the stem cell, I thought that they removed the bone marrow from the individual, but what was replaced was their own stem cells, but they still had to be matched. Is that the deal?
Yeah, they still have to be matched
Oh.
because it isn't just the bone marrow stem cells they're replacing. There's some of the immune system that goes in with it.
Okay.
It's the competing immune systems that lead to problems, big problems sometimes.
Okay. Janelle, you had a question?
Mhm.
No, I just wanted to talk about my brother because he did a bone marrow transplant when I was younger. He was one of the first people that did the bone marrow transplant. My sister and it's three of us. We both have the same mother and father. So my sister didn't have the illness, but she had the same parents. So she was able to be the donor for my brother to get the bone marrow transplant. And he now, but well, not really care because he still have pain. He went to all um when he killed off his immune system. He blew up like he was purple, like a raisin, and it was. I seen a whole bunch of things as a young child. Still see my brother going through this, but he always told me stories of being in like a facility where it was all these different rooms in one room, and each child had a different disease, and that they was testing to see if the transplant worked. If they would cure different illnesses and stuff. And but with him, when he got it, his body rejected new blood. Like, it's a chance that your body will accept the blood, reject the blood, or reject both your blood. And then, what are you left with? Your body's not gonna produce blood. So they ended up trying one more time with my sister blood, and his body started producing the blood, like the new blood that wasn't sickle, like, So, he says he still has pain, but I done research and they say it's just pain from the scar tissue of the sickling pain that he have experienced when he was like younger, because he was more sicker than I was. But I had a question for Dr. Walters. Do you guys follow up with the patients that do the transplant, like over after they're cured and stuff? Do you guys, follow up like with them, the patient?
Yes, we at a minimum of 5 years, we follow up after the transplant, and for the gene therapy, the follow up lasts 15 years. So it's longer because it's a newer treatment that we want to capture all the information about. But it's not forever, which is scary. And this is one of the policy things that I think needs to change, because we need a lifelong registry of everyone who's had one of these treatments, so that we learn. We could be missing important information just because they're out of the system, and we need a registry that lasts lifelong, I think, for every person born with sickle cell disease in the country. And it should begin at birth, and it should go life. I mean, every other, a lot of these other hereditary diseases have that kind of registry. So this is an important policy funding issue that's an opportunity for advocacy, I think, and we need to do better.
That was a really good question.
I just want to say, Dr. Walters, that you and I need to have a conversation about that particular topic, and let's see how we can move that forward with, everybody in the community, the SCD community, because that needs to be forever. So and
maybe we could start. I mean, California is always a leader of the nation, and so maybe we should focus on the state of California.
There we go.
The country how to do it.
Okay, well, I got it on my list, and I'll be talking to Dr. Raleigh, Adrian Shapiro, and Pat Corley, and all the rest of them. Yes.
Let's go.
We need a lifelong registry. You can't lose these people or let them get lost and fall through the cracks, because going through this procedures and this process, that's what we need. We want that data to keep up with how things are progressing, so that we can further move this forward and be able to supply that to the people that are coming behind them. Because, well, I hate to say this, but I'm gonna, everybody talks about this number of 100,000 people living with sickle cell, and I'm sorry, that number it just can't be right. It just can't be that way every year. I'm so sick of that number, because the cultures are mixing. You have no idea. My son has a daughter. She is Black and Asian. It's moving around, people. So they both have the trait. I didn't even know my youngest son had the trait. I knew my oldest son had the disease, but I found out later, because I think he was probably born before they actually were testing the babies. So then once he had a daughter, now she has the trait, and he had his son, and his son has nothing, which is cool. But I'm just saying that these numbers are changing yearly, and the amount of people that have the trait are the people that are carrying the disease. And if we don't keep up with what's going on and how the cultures are mixing, it's going to be everybody's disease at some point. So this whole registry we talking about with this new developments of therapies that we're utilizing, yes, it needs to be tracked. You just can't just let it go after 5 years or 10 years and say, hey, it's over or we're done. No, it's not. It needs to, it has to be forever. And just like you said, like all these other diseases. So yeah, I just want to share that. I got a strong position about that.
Look, true indeed. And we saw that with the crack epidemic. If you need another example of how it spills outside of the borders of a certain community.
Look at that. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to break up the conversation.
Oh, no apologies needed. All good stuff that needed to be shared, and great questions, great points. So please interrupt me at any point. Actually, I was ready to wrap up what I started to talk about and what we touched on already earlier in the conversation. I think I have some things that I learned throughout my journey that I think helped me, and I think would help other patients with sickle cell disease.
Absolutely.
I always caveat this, because we shouldn't have to do all that I'm about to say. We shouldn't have to do that. But this is the climate that we're at right now in terms of sickle cell disease in America. And I can't even begin to touch on the additional hurdles that people globally have to get before they get to even what I'm talking about. I think this is too much. And I haven't even begun to scratch the surface on other people who don't have access to hydroxyurea or Tylenol. So
please, we don't even want to go there. But
we don't even want to go there.
I mean, get it.
We should.
Yeah,
but
not today, but
not to, we got to have a whole nother conversation about that.
Absolutely. And we just
and then also
recognize there's lots of work to be done.
Yes, there's lots of work to be done. And also some tips and things that I think on the receiving end of medical care that I think went well for how clinicians supported me, and then things that I think could be areas of improvement for clinicians, that it's not just starting with the clinic, it's the whole medical system. So talking about those two categories of things. So I think my first point that I want to mention about things that I learned and continue to challenge myself, and I want to challenge other patients with sickle cell disease, is honestly evaluating where you're at physically and emotionally. And I know Jimmy and I both talked about being at a place of desperation before considering curative therapy. And I think that as a group of people who basically learn to suffer and learn to suffer well, we're still productive, we still show up to our jobs, we still show up to school, it doesn't matter how we're feeling. People don't even know we have sickle cell until we're not there. I think it's really important for us to learn how to view ourselves from the outside, a bird's eye view, and say, hey, I know I'm used to suffering. I know I'm used to getting through life no matter what it throws at me, but where am I for real? And I think it didn't take me until that question to myself, because I just thought I was going to push through sickle cell, push through medical school, even though I was suffering every single day. I just got to get through it, and then maybe I'll reevaluate. And when I really thought about that, I was like, could you see yourself doing this forever? Could you see yourself holding a career as a physician doing this? Can I see myself enjoying my life doing this? And there are sometimes that has to be the reality for some people. Like if you don't respond to curative therapy or you don't have access, that is the unfortunate reality. But I think it's important for us to start from a place of, if that wasn't my reality, what would I want?
Right.
And so it took me realizing I was not at a place physically and emotionally where I felt like I could keep on with this. And so then what? What's next? And I then realized there are these options. And that's when I considered all the disease modifying options. That's what got me to start hydroxyurea and Endari. And I had already been part of the clinical trial for crizanlizumab in 2016, but I decided to do that again and take it and say, I'm doing what I can to change the reality that I have now. And so I decided to try all those disease-modifying therapeutic drugs to see if that could improve my quality of life and help me to live a life that I would actually want for myself, not one that I have to push through. It turns out none of those drugs ended up creating a significant difference in my quality of life. And that's when I became challenged. The next point is to leaning into my fears. I think I've had several conversations with other patients with sickle cell and myself. And it's like, I know sickle cell, but I don't know transplant. I don't know gene therapy. I don't know what side effects are going to come with that. And it's easier to run away from the fear than to address it. But I think it's really important as a community that's been abandoned by the medical system for us to lean into the fears and get the information that we're needing to know. Because a lot of times the fears comes out of a place of lack of education. And because clinicians aren't necessarily bringing this up to us as a topic, as an opportunity to leave our suffering, then we are just stuck at a place of, I don't know enough about this. I don't know what I should be knowing. I don't know if this is going to be a bad thing or a good thing, so I'm going to avoid it altogether and deal with what I do know, which is getting through life with sickle cell disease. So I think it's really important to lean into your fears. And more importantly than that is to, or at least not more importantly, but as a result of leaning into your fears, is seeking to become an expert. And again, I will caveat this is something we shouldn't have to do, but it's where we're at right now. And I would not have had the transplant. I can say this with confidence if I hadn't decided to become the expert for myself. And that was how I ended up watching the lecture from American Society of Hematology, or was it Vertex? It was a lecture given by an institution that is looks to provide curative therapies. And the lecture was for clinicians, but I watched it anyway. And that's when I saw Jimi's patient experience from that lecture. And so I started watching a whole bunch of other lectures on gene therapy, on transplant, on graft versus host disease. I went to the website, the National Institutes of Health clinical trials. I learned about every single sickle cell trial that was open, that was closed, that was about to open, learned about the eligibility criteria, learned where those clinical trials were happening. And that really gave me the power to say, okay, actually, now that I've learned more about this, this doesn't seem as scary to me anymore because I have the objective facts. Is it still scary? Yes. But I know what I didn't know. I know what I don't know, and I do know more than I did before. So that helped me to be able to have these conversations with my providers about graft versus host disease and have an awareness when they tell me something, I have already read up on it. So that is very important in becoming an expert in sickle cell and the options that are available to you. And another point I really want to make is not to give up and to be persistent. And that is easier said than done. And I think what really helped me to not give up, even though I did several times, was having a community, having cheerleaders of family members, friends, clinicians who are willing to support you, even when everybody tells you no and you are so tired of fighting, to have someone who's going to say, I got you, keep going. I had a friend who wrote down for me, I told her I'd given up and, oh, I'm going to get emotional. And I still have this piece of paper. And she wrote down all the things I deserved in life. And she wrote down all the questions I could ask my provider. And it was at that conversation that I had with her that I had the courage and the strength to bring those topics up to my doctor after I had been told no. And without the people surrounding me, and my donor also called me and he said, don't give up, like this is closer than you think. And it can be really hard and you can feel like you're fighting a fight that you will never win. But I think it's really important to dig in, to push back. We're on the cusp of change. The fact that we're having this conversation right now is really just groundbreaking, and don't give up in thinking that this is the life that you're forced to live forever. Keep trying every avenue you can to get what you need. And there are people out there who want to support you, who want to see better for patients with sickle cell disease. So hold tight to that truth. And then another important thing is to understand the potential outcomes of each curative therapy and what you're willing to risk and what you're not willing to risk. If you want to have children, are you willing to risk infertility? If you need to finish your career in a certain area, are you willing to sacrifice the time? What are you willing to accept as a risk? And every option for curative therapy comes with a risk, and we have to be okay. We have to determine what we're okay with sacrificing. Like my hair, I had dreadlocks like you, Elon, and I missed them. They were blonde, and I still have the bag in my bathroom. But yeah, I had to decide, you know what? I'm willing to get rid of my hair for it in order to do this thing. And so being able to understand what the risks are and what you're willing to sacrifice in order to pursue your journey to being sickle cell free. And then lastly is to dream big. Imagine and understand your best case scenario. I think we're so quick to imagine worst case scenario because that's all we've been dealt living with sickle cell disease. And it took my community, my friends, clinicians who really supported me to imagine and dream best case scenarios with me. And I remember asking Dr. Walters and my hematologist so many times, I was like, is the pain gonna go away? Like, are you sure I'm eligible? Are you sure there's like more chance that this will work than it won't? And Dr. Walters, as he talked about everything, he doesn't leave any details out. And he also was encouraging me in the areas like, you know what, I think that there is a reasonable possibility that this would work. That's the information that I have. He shared with me the data. So imagine your best case scenario. Even though you have to come to terms with the worst case scenario, still make room to imagine your best case scenario. And then quickly, I know I am over my time, just to wrap up important tips for clinicians. And this is a question that I recently came up to my mind in terms of understanding when it's appropriate to intervene with curative therapy for patients with sickle cell disease, and what threshold we should be using as a marker for when to start considering these options. And Dr. Walters has a great paper already written and published years ago about those considerations. And I know I had talked about people telling me I wasn't eligible because none of my organs had technically failed yet or were on the way to failure. But if, as a clinician, if your mother, child, friend, family member came with the complaints of a patient with sickle cell disease, extreme pain, extreme fatigue, loss of quality of life, unable to do groceries for yourself, unable to wash your hair, constantly taking morphine or paracetamol, or having to stay home from certain events, if someone you knew and loved came to you with years and years and years of those symptoms, what would you want done? How much would you intervene to help get that patient to a better place? And I think that's a question clinicians would benefit from asking themselves, because we're in a place right now where it's numbers and looking at data, but I think it's really important to hear the patient's suffering in their words and not just from a objective categorical numbers and data that we can see. Look past the numbers and understand what the patient is telling you. If they can't show up to work, then maybe what can we consider to make that better? And I think that might be a reasonable enough thing to ask for in terms of curative therapy if we're suffering in that way. And then the last, but definitely not least, most important thing I think for clinicians and the whole medical system to take into account is understanding your biases. The system is already biased. It is entrenched in bias. It is built on bias. Whether it is intentional or not, it exists. And so all clinicians have been trained through that framework and lens. And having gone through medical school myself, I know that you have to actively unlearn those things. You have to actively be fighting against what is being taught to you. And so I'm not saying that clinicians intentionally want to bias and hurt us, but clinicians are fed that information. And as a clinician, it is important for you to categorically and very specifically combat those biases. And so I think it starts from a place of awareness. And a lot of people who have hurt us, I don't think have the intention of doing so, but they do. And so I think it's a good place for every clinician to start in terms of making a better life for patients with sickle cell disease.
It's unfortunate.
So that's my point. I'm done.
And you're good. It's good. You know, it's a matter of ignorance, and it's unfortunate. And that's what we have to deal with, you know, that level of mentality. So everything that you've said, but everybody has a role, everybody plays a part in this process. And everybody deserves the same health care that everybody else is getting. We shouldn't be relegated to whatever you want to. And I understand. But my feeling as well, medical professionals, they take an oath, just like police, to protect and serve. You know, now we got a lot of police serving, they may not be protecting, but you know, such what it is. But in the medical field, right, everybody, people living with sickle cell go to the professionals for for help. They're not there for any other reason. So what they suffer from is the what they have to deal with in getting what they need. That's the unfortunate part to all of this. So we as a group and everybody involved have to be a part of the process and not a part of the problem. So, and I want to thank you, Dr. Walters, so much. I really appreciate you and your time and all of this great, valuable information that you've given us today, along with Jimi. Jimi, I want to ask you, do you have any closing words that you want to share, sir, that we can see your face one more time?
I'm not able to, I can't turn on the camera right now.
Okay.
But I can in terms of, I excuse the background noise. I had to step out.
No worries.
But I really just want to echo everything Christelle mentioned. Is I think for me, like I said, it was really just giving up on giving up, and it sounds so cliche to say, but it's actually, I think one of the reasons why I'm still here is just trucking on day in and day out. While it's difficult, I had a really, really good support system, so that helped a lot.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we tend to forget is to really give a lot of credit to our caregivers. I think they need to be elevated as well. I don't think we'll be where we're at without them.
Yes.
Make sure they're good, their mental health as well is good, because, though they might not be suffering from physical complications of our disease, they're suffering from it as well in their own way.
Absolutely.
So just, really excited for the future. And just keep hanging in there.
And I want to keep in touch with you, Jimmy. Dr.
Definitely.
Walters, do you have anything that you would like to say in closing?
Thanks so much for having me. I think it's just so encouraging when we do these things together, because it's a partnership.
Right.
And I really hope this catalyzes more action, and that we get some momentum, and let's go from here. So I am just so excited to be in a partnership with warriors and advocates, and to break down the barriers that Christelle and Jimmy articulated so clearly today. Christelle's a rock, and I don't think I've ever seen her cry before. I started to fall apart a little bit. So, but that point, what are the key things about life that I want to accomplish? Let's figure out how to make that a positive response in the future for everybody.
Absolutely. And just so that you all know, it doesn't end necessarily at 1 o'clock. So if there's anybody else on here that has any questions or any thoughts or any comments, we're more than open and welcoming it all, because like I said, we don't have to be done, but if we are done, it's all good. I really appreciate everybody and their time and being a part of today's presentation. We look to try and service the sickle cell community, and we are open to any request that comes from the sickle cell community about presenters that they feel or that they would like to have in this arena. So just pass that on, and just know that, like I said, you, Christelle, you and I have a relationship, me and Dr. Walters now, we've connected again, right? Because you remember me from, do you recall me from a previous seminar with Dr. Raleigh and Adrian Sapiro I was on? It was some time
Yes,
ago.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah, because I wept
together.
then. Yeah, right. And you were so consoling, and that's why I said I've got to get this guy back. But I appreciate everybody that attended today, and please fill out the evaluation. It's in the chat box. And Jimmy said, thank you for having me. So happy to have participated in such an important discussion. Yes, we are so happy to have had you and that you were available. Like I said, I'm going to let Elon close this out. Reminders about the sign-in wine, June 17th, and the walk in Oakland on June 18th.
All right.
Thank
you guys, it's been a wonderful morning into early afternoon. My kid, he listened. I'm so happy. He's a large part of my why. I was like, man, do I want to sign up and get healthy so I can be here? Because in a minute, he's going to be, hopefully this 6'2", 6'3". I'm only 5'4". I got to be able to go toe to toe with him. But yes, Christelle, honey, I remember how much you spent on this makeup. Don't cry. You don't want these lashes coming off. But yes, thank you for being so uncensored and vulnerable with all the information shared today, from the medical perspective, from the perspective of patients and individuals. I don't even want to call you patients, from people that have participated in this journey. I tell my patients with addiction medicine that recovery is a team sport. Sickle cell.
Yes.
Dealing with everything sickle cell related is a team sport. We need each other to get through this.
Yes.
And it's going to take a lot of collaborative effort. It's going to take a lot of cultural competency. It's all those words that we talk about, meeting patients where they're at and all that good stuff. But it takes all of us. We all have a role in this. No role is too small. No role is too great. So thank you for being present today. Please complete the survey, the evaluation of today's session, and give your honest feedback. That is the only way that we are going to share slides with you. You give us something, we give you something. So
the link is in the chat
check out
box.
our website. It is in the chat box. Our website, www.scaasf.org. And you can stay posted up to date, current on all of our events. This session will be posted. Our previous sessions have been posted, and all the good things we're doing in the community. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, all of those social media platforms. So I think I dotted all the I's and crossed the T's, hopefully. Awesome. Got the okay from Nadina. So your Saturday is yours. Thank you so much for being here. You guys stay blessed. Take care.
Have a great rest of
You
your weekend.
too.